Hi, I'm Rosie Robertson. I'm a Professor of Social Sustainability at Anglia Ruskin University. This is the third episode of my podcast, How to Feel Better About Climate Change, recorded for the Chelmsford Science Festival 2025. I like to take a thread from a previous episode in order to build the next episode, and this time I wanted to build on something that one of my previous guests, Deb Lane, had said around how she saw UK culture with fresh eyes when she returned from working on an environmental project in Tanzania. I thought this was really interesting, and I wanted to explore this idea of how new environments or new cultures can shift our perspectives. To do this, I'm going to be speaking to two guests. The first is Dan Ryan, an environmentalist and educator. Dan, it's a real pleasure to have you on this episode. I've worked with you for around 8 years, I think now, which has been an absolute pleasure. But I wondered if you could start by just introducing yourself a little bit.
My name's Dan. I am an earthling. I live on the south coast of Cornwall, where I've lived for I've lived in Cornwall for about 30 years, I think. And for most of my adult life, or most of my useful adult life anyway, I've worked at the Eden Project in Cornwall, which is how we came across each other, Rosie, about 8 to 10 years ago on the Masters in Sustainability, mainly, and then a few other things. And recently, this year, I moved to the Lost Gardens of Heligan on the south coast of Cornwall, where I've been since June. I find it difficult to say what I do. I find it a lot easier to say what I don't do. I'm a bit of a generalist, with interests in ecology, nature, education, business, sustainability, and all of that stuff, and particularly how all of that stuff sort of blends together, how it all smashes together, and we can work across the different boundaries of all of those different things.
I find it really interesting that you say you find it hard to say what you do, because I was struggling to think about what's your job title, what's your role. I was trying to think about how I would describe you, and I similarly struggled. But what I have seen you do, Dan, at the work at Eden in particular, is this really expert delivery of sort of what I would call non-traditional learning experiences. So often I've seen you working with students in Eden, in amazing environments, amazing surroundings, and I've seen you kind of inspire, provoke, challenge students in very interesting ways. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about what do you think about when you are trying to create that kind of experience for people?
I think the way that you frame the question is kind of you're good at non-traditional learning, which is very kind, but also sort of points to the problem, doesn't it? And the privilege. I've had the privilege of not being in traditional settings. Traditional education settings can be marvelously unsatisfactory for both the educators and the learners. So I've had the privilege of working in really quite beautiful, and probably many educators listening will be thinking, oh, well, it's really easy to teach people in the rainforest biome, or it's really easy to teach people at the Lost Gardens of Heligan, these kind of achingly beautiful places where it seems obviously easier to inspire people, but it's not quite that easy, I don't think. So my starting point for delivering this kind of learning is really quite simple. It's what would I like to be doing? I would much rather be out in the woods than in a square classroom with white walls staring at a screen at the front of the room. And 90-something% of the learning that I'm going to use this word quite pointedly, that we inflict on our learners is white rooms, rows of chairs, screen at the front. Okay, the teacher could be doing great, but if we stopped and thought about it, it's probably the worst place in which we might want to inspire or get young people or groups of learners to think differently, to think interestingly, and to get them out of the box, which has probably caused much of the problems in the first place.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You talk about the privilege of being able to teach in a slightly different way. I've actually just come this morning from running a small group session at our local secondary school. This is a maths enrichment sessions that I run, so nothing's kind of directly to do with environmental education. But I do feel that it's very privileged to be able to run things in this kind of small group setting, actually, because teachers are obviously managing much larger class sizes, have got curriculums they have to abide by, have got all sorts of other constraints. And really, we don't have to step too far to this to become, very much kind of political economic questions that we're talking about, is that how could you deliver something like this on a broader scale?
That's a great question. I was with a group of teachers last Wednesday evening at Helligan, and we were asking them almost exactly that question. And a few key themes began to emerge. One, some teachers don't have the confidence to take their groups outside into those kind of settings. So there's a bit of CPD there around how can we develop the confidence in those teachers to be a bit braver on that front. There is some safety in the classroom. I don't know myself. There is safety in the whiteboard and the pictures on the screen. They are a safety net for me if all else fails. I think there's a huge amount of, we need to wonder about what education is for. We've got a bit trapped in a system that I think is struggling to know what it's for anymore in a world that is changing so rapidly. I'll give a slight example, not as a way to have a dig at this particular course, but I did a lot of work with a very, very large university in the southwest of the UK, and I would meet their second year plant science students every year. These second year plant science students were all over the genomics of stuff. They were all over biotech, but they had never been taken on a field trip outside to meet plants in the real world. So there's this, and we're seeing that all over this educational system. We've acquired increasingly specialist knowledge, but really forgotten how it relates to the real world. So kind of, what's the point of knowing the genes of Arabidopsis or something if you can't identify Arabidopsis in the wild or wonder about its ecology or why it's growing in the place? So I think some of that is also a bit of a driver for some of the work that I do.
So for this podcast episode, I wanted to explore a particular angle which kind of came up in one of the previous episodes. And it was this idea that when we experience new environments, new places, and that can either be sort of the physical environment, but also the culture of a new place, that it can actually help us see things kind of with new perspectives. I experienced this actually when I lived abroad not for a very long period of time, a few months, but I felt it taught me more about the UK than I expected. And I wanted to ask you about this idea of kind of seeing with new eyes and this kind of perspective shift that people can kind of experience when they are in new environments. Whether you've observed this, whether you've experienced it yourself, could you talk about that a little bit?
It's useful to wonder why going into new places can be so revealing. And again, there's some privilege here, isn't it? If we've had the privilege to travel or work somewhere, that's something that lots of other people can't have. And we need to make sure that we can open up those experiences to as many people as possible. What I did see over and over again at the Eden Project, was when people walked into the rainforest biome, something often immediately you could see their mind click. I speak with a lot of, and I've worked with a lot of business leaders and people who work in business and universities and that kind of sector. And nearly always we have to try and solve the problems of our workplace in the confines of these same boring environments, at our desk, in a boardroom, in an office, in a certain sort of meeting setup, when really we should take our problems to the beach or the woods or abroad. We should be able to say to our boss, hey boss, I've got a really sticky problem. I need some time to think about it. I'm going to go for a walk. So there's something about what can unlock when you are in these kind of places. And particularly if those places have been designed to sort of alter the human experience, if you like. And in the case of Eden, it was the architecture itself that was also part of that story, this kind of sense of being inside something so vast that this necessarily altered your perspective, which is, we typically live in a similar sort of scale. I mean, a regular, on the small side, I suppose, house. So going in somewhere that is so vast and so much different to our usual has some real benefits in this kind of world.
You know what that makes me think of, which I have never done before? It makes me think of visiting cathedrals. I have never made that kind of connection before.
Cathedrals are another perfect example. They are vast, they are beautiful, they are inspired by nature. They are clearly designed to connect us or make us, force us to think about something else, something bigger than us. And I would have no problem at all describing the Eden Project biomes as cathedrals to nature.
Okay, so as you know, this podcast, one of the themes of it is around emotion and the role that emotion plays when we think about kind of climate change and sustainability issues. And I noticed when looking at your profile before this interview that you describe yourself as an eco-optimist. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you mean by that and whether it's something that comes naturally to you, or do you sort of make yourself, do you work on this?
I've never been asked to explain this before, so I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. At least I think I'm grateful to have this opportunity. Why I call myself an eco-optimist on my LinkedIn profile and in a few other places is, one, it's slightly glib, and it sort of does the job of, in a couple of words, which might otherwise take quite a lot of words. But there is a bit of a story behind it. And some of the background to the story was a sort of long-running internal debate at Eden that was going on 10, 15 years ago or so. And this was about the role of hope in all of this stuff. And then it really became a story. I met a couple of people called Mark within a year or two of each other. One of them was a fellow called Mark Nelson. And Mark Nelson was one of the original biospherians. So he inhabited the Biosphere 2 project in Arizona in the late 1990s. And I had the privilege of spending a few days with Mark Nelson, and he wrote a lovely book about his experiences in Biosphere 2. And in there, he described himself as an eco-optimist. Oh, that's interesting. I quite like that. Don't know why yet, but I quite like it. I also then met a fellow called Mark Stevenson, who again might be someone who is familiar to some of the people listening. He's one half of the Futurenauts with Ed Gillespie, but about 10 years ago wrote a really lovely book called An Optimist's Guide to the Future. And in there, he laid out kind of 7 principles, I think, the practical principles of what it means to be optimistic about the future. And a combination of hanging out with those 2 people made me wonder that optimism is not a state of mind, it's actually a state of doing. And it has to be a practical set of activities, or a practical way to continually engage with this.
And just to sort of continue a little bit on that theme, I was wondering, kind of linking back to what you were talking before about kind of educational experiences and your work on that, about what you see the role of emotion being in those experiences. Is this something that you recognize plays a role? How do people tend to engage with their emotions when they're taking part in these sessions?
I think one of the downsides of our current education system is that it is very, very head dominated. Through being outside, through movement, some of the other things that I've talked about earlier, we need to get that learning into our thoughts, our emotion, but also into our hands, just doing stuff with this practical optimism, this pragmatic optimism that I was talking about a moment ago. So one of the guiding frameworks for mine and also the work of Eden and Halligan's education is head, heart, hands. And this comes from or was popularized by an American environmentalist called David Orr, who was introduced to me by Alison Gregg from Anglia Ruskin University about 10 or something years ago. And I thought this is really delightful. I think where I try and take that is into a particular signature of some of my work is that it is really, really story rich. So it tries to not be all about the facts. You know, I quite enjoy a fact or two. I have quite a good memory for facts. I don't think they're particularly useful, and I don't think they're very good learning tools. So I don't mind if other people don't have a set of facts about my particular problem, my particular disease is that I can remember loads and loads of names of plants and mushrooms and stuff. And we'll all have our own particular diseases that we mustn't try and inflict on everyone else. But so there's a role for this kind of thing. I'm much more interested, I think, in wondering about how we can alter how people feel about certain things. Because time and time again, I would stand in front of a group of people and ask them, when was the last time you changed your mind about anything significant? And most people, most of the time, stare blankly and no one puts a hand up. About the most common and almost the only answer that people ever give on that front is something like, I became a vegetarian or I became vegan, something dietary. And those are pretty significant changes to alter one's entire diet. But beyond that, and yet the whole premise of each of our work is in this sort of behavior change space where there's this requirement at the other end for people to change their minds, and not only change their minds, for them to turn that into action, and this pragmatic optimism that I've been talking about, and away you go. And it's really hard to get people to change their minds. So I think the only thing really that can allow us to change is by feeling a bit different, because facts clearly haven't worked. The environment industry movement, I'd said industry then, and that's a fairly accurate description for much of it, actually. The environment movement since the 1960s has been beating us over the head with facts, and it hasn't worked. We've heard about how much rainforests have been destroyed. We largely haven't done much about that. We've been hearing about the rise of carbon dioxide parts per million and what the very obvious causes of this are, and it doesn't seem to do much. So facts have only got us so far. And yet there's whole tranches of this world that we inhabit which are producing more and more facts, and sort of idle hope that one day more facts will do it.
That's so fascinating. And what a brilliant question. When was the last time you changed your mind about something significant? I mean, that is so interesting. And it makes me think two things. One is I can absolutely imagine that people aren't changing their minds very often. But I'm also thinking that people aren't necessarily always observing when they do or remembering it. It's sort of like, well, I think that and I've always thought that, but it's not the case. And I just think that there's a research project in that, Dan. It's so interesting. As I said, what a brilliant question. Dan raised a number of interesting points in his reflections. He talked about how the environment in which we try to learn or try to teach people can really influence what we might be open to, whether we might be open to changing our mind, for example, and how we might be able to think outside the box. He even raised bigger questions around what is education for in the first place. But I didn't just want to talk about how our physical environment might influence perspective shifts. I also wanted to talk about our cultural environment. And for this, I invited on my colleague, Dr. Zareen Bharucha. I started by asking Zareen to introduce herself.
I am a senior research fellow at the Global Sustainability Institute at Anglia Ruskin University, where I would describe myself as an environmental social scientist. So I'm interested in how people respond to environmental change and shape environmental change and connect with nature.
Now, Zareen, there are a number of reasons why I'm really excited to have you on this podcast. But in particular, there was an area I wanted to ask you to talk about, and that is your deep experience of living within different cultures. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the story of that.
Sure, that's such an interesting thing to reflect on, I think. So I've lived now exactly half my life in India and half my life in the UK. Very, very different societies, but obviously with very deep cultural and historical threads connecting them. When I reflect on the similarities and the differences, because they sometimes illuminate where those come from. We've both learned from each other, and our societies have shaped each other's in very interesting ways. So I grew up in India, and I was in India for the first 21, 22 years of my life. And I was always a little bit of an outlier, I think, relative to my peers, because I had strong interests in nature and the environment, which seemed to be innate quite early on, but which were also shaped by the fact that quite uniquely, I grew up with free-range access to a farm that was on the outskirts of the city where I grew up. I grew up in a lovely little city called Pune. And at the time, the farm was on the outskirts of the city. Of course, now the city has enveloped the farm. So it's a interesting urban green island. But when I was growing up, I had access to that farm, and I had access to what we know in the literature on children and childhood access to nature is very important, which was unsupervised alone time in green spaces with no agenda, which of course now is considered quite unsafe, and very few people have that luxury. It's very much just a stroke of luck, I think, in my life that I had that. And that really shaped my interest in nature. And of course, a lot of my peers, unfortunately, did not have that, growing up in the middle of quite a dense Indian city where green space is very limited. So that has definitely shaped me in interesting ways. And then coming here to the UK, I think that access to green space and the ability to be alone in it and to be free-ranging, I have just magnified that in my life, because very, very luckily, I think the UK does afford you the opportunity to do that relative to what some of my peers would have had in India. I think we do hear a lot in the UK about lack of access to green space, and I can absolutely see why. But from my perspective, there's much more than I would be used to if I grew up in a typical high-rise flat in an Indian city.
It's so interesting. And again, it just, for me, really illustrates this almost, we sort of take things for granted, what we have access to, how things are. And again, I was mentioning this to our other interviewee, Dan, that I spent just a few months living abroad when I was a teenager. And I felt that it really changed my perspective on, things. It's like, oh, we do that in the UK. That's not, it doesn't have to be like that. You can actually do things differently. And I just find it so fascinating. So I was wondering if there were any other perspectives that you might have in terms of the differences, I guess, between society in the UK and India, particularly obviously for the topic of this podcast in terms of sustainability and climate change, and anything that you've observed about maybe how we think about things here that are seen very differently there, or vice versa.
It's been quite interesting reflecting on how we talk about high levels of material consumption in the UK or the West more generically, and people trying to return to lives full of meaning and human flourishing that are not so tightly tied with material consumption. And it's interesting to me to reflect as an Indian in the 21st century, where, of course, we know that in India, levels of material consumption are rising as the country is urbanizing, industrializing, and people very, very luckily have much more disposable income now, which is all for the good. But it's been interesting to me to reflect on how I started out life in a country where, for example, I had a bath every day in a single bucket of water. Not because we were limited in our access, but just because that's the way it was always done. And I didn't really encounter fast food or packet food or plastic packaging for a very, very long time, deep into adolescence, I think, when I started having my own pocket money and disposable income, and it started becoming fashionable to go to McDonald's. And my life and the life of my friends, and certainly my parents and our extended circle, was very much woven around the people you know and the places where you gather. And they were very, very tight-knit communities of people and places, which was what was considered to be the good life. And it's been very interesting to me to come here and to study and learn and reflect and later research transitions to sustainability being about those kind of tight-knit community bonds, and about how fulfilling that can be when you're transitioning away from a life way that is tied in with material consumption. And I think that would be one of the strongest lessons in sustainability, I guess, that growing up in India has given me.
That's so fascinating. And I find it really interesting how you have connected in your answer just then these issues, which could seemingly seem very disconnected. So you talked about this idea of packaging, which is a really interesting example, because it's something that I think is quite, visible for a lot of people. I think a lot of people, certainly who are maybe within environmental movements, might kind of long for a world where we have less plastic packaging. And, you've obviously got people making big efforts to try to reduce plastic consumption. But then you've also been talking about this idea of tight-knit community and about, so when you were experiencing a life without plastic packaging, then it was also accompanied by this kind of people who were very connected together. And I find that so interesting. What's the connection between those two things?
I think if I was being flippant, I would say that there's a sort of tension between people and plastic. I think there's this life way which you could I'm exaggerating and caricaturing for the sake of illustration, but I think there's a life way in which you can center your life around people and humanness and connection and ideas. And I sound very idealistic. And then there's a sort of other life way where, of course, you are connected to the people you love and the places where you live, but it's the things and the income required to support the purchase of those things and the materiality of those things in a never-ending cycle of more and more and more, which can become very, very important. And I am pitting them against each other because I think beyond a certain point, there is a real trade-off between one and the other. I think one of the lessons of coming from there and then coming here and then living here and starting a family here has been that as beyond a certain point, there's a trade-off between the people and the plastic. And you have to sort of decide which one are you going to. You can either get sucked into very, very high levels of material consumption, which seem to draw people in very effectively and seductively. They certainly drew me in for the first whole 10 years of my life here. I mean, my first trip alone in the UK was to Oxford Circus, and I saw the Topshop building, and that was just incredible. And so that's very seductive and powerful, but I think it comes at a certain cost.
I think you've put that so brilliantly there. And I think that it is a really interesting idea that somehow when we have the communities, the people, the support networks, we are less in need of the possessions, the stuff, the plastic. Don't think we've ever really had much of a conversation about some of my family background with a great-grandparent who is Sri Lankan and who actually came over to study in the UK, married a British woman, went back to live in Sri Lanka for a decade, had 4 children, and then emigrated to the UK just at the end of the Second World War. And it's really fascinating. I know less about the history than I would like to, but thinking about just the nuggets that I've picked up about the differences in culture between, and the massive shock there was basically for them moving at that time and coming from. So, for example, we still have a lot of the furniture that was made for their family by people that they employed, I think often. I have some in my house, this amazing long-lasting furniture that none of us want to get rid of, even though some of it's quite outsized for the space here. But it's lasted, and it's a very different setup and that kind of relationship with possessions. I mean, obviously that was partly of the time as well.
And it's funny you mentioned furniture. So my grandparents on my father's side commissioned this wardrobe and bedroom set that is still in my house. My mother uses it. The wardrobe is in my childhood bedroom. And it's a solid piece of furniture, no MDF board. It's solid teak through and through. It was designed and built at a great cost, obviously, but designed to last for generations, which indeed it has. And I've always felt, even before coming here and reading about these things in these terms, that there's something very ensouled about that stuff, which infuses it with meaning in a way that I would never associate with the table that I'm sitting on now, which was just put together out of a flat pack, and I could easily replace because it really didn't cost very much. And the minute I see something else in a magazine or on Instagram, I will probably feel an itch to replace. But I would never think about that wardrobe and the bed my mum now sleeps on as being fashionable. It's beyond that. It's just going to stay. No one's going to get rid of it.
I've really enjoyed the conversations with my two guests for this episode, and as ever, it's gone in directions I didn't quite expect. I loved Dan's question so much, I actually made it into the title of this episode. When was the last time you changed your mind? And I felt that Zareen talked so eloquently about the tension between consumption and community. The hopeful note that I end on is the idea that even if there are things that we haven't really worked out in our society, there may be others who have, and perhaps we can learn from them. If you want to read more about emotions, climate, and positive action, feel free to have a look at my website, www.begreenchange.com. And you might want to check out the previous episodes of this podcast too. You're also very welcome to get in touch with me. Just Google Rosie Robison and you can find me. Bye for now.